We're moving into the neurophysiology stuff, so we're going to be moving into the nervous system, and then we'll integrate it with the musculoskeletal system, fill in some gaps from the neuromuscular junction and the action and potentials and all that stuff that we've seen the past few lectures. So the first thing that we want to do is identify or define the functions of the nervous system. Alright, so our different functions of the nervous system, we're going to sense change, interpret the change, and respond to the stimuli. So in terms of these detecting or sensing this change, this change is going to be detecting stimuli. And when we talked about stimuli before, we've talked about some certain stimuli can throw us out of homeostasis. And if we've been thrown out of homeostasis, then that means that stimuli is considered a stressor. So we just want to get refamiliated with some of these words. Alright, so we're getting familiar with these different words like stimuli, stressors. To interpret this change, we'll typically do this with our spinal cord and the brain. And we'll look at that part of the nervous system in a little bit. And then we'll respond to this stimuli. So we'll do an action. Typically we'll take an action. So let's do an example. Let's say that we have a house. Actually, no. We'll just say a fire pit. Here's our fire pit, and it's got some logs in there, and these logs are on fire. Alright, so there's our fire, and you're standing next to it. So let's say you say, sometimes when we see a bright light, we might walk towards it. Let's say we have no idea what this thing is. We don't know that this is a fire, okay? But as we walk up to it, we're detecting these stimuli. We're detecting a few different things. Our photoreceptors in our eyes are detecting this light being emitted. We can feel on our skin, we have these thermoreceptors for heat. We feel the heat. And as we get closer and closer, as that gets hotter and hotter, our brain is starting to interpret that, saying, hey, this might be a stimuli that can throw us out of homeostasis. This might put us in a body temperature that's out of optimal range, or it might be a temperature that can cause some damage to our body. So we'll respond to it. So we'll take an action. So maybe we'll step back. Alright, so we're detecting these stimuli, things like light, things like pressure, things like heat. Our brain and spinal cord will detect those stimuli, interpret what they mean. Okay, this can be threatening to me if I continue to walk towards it, and then we'll take an action to respond to that stimuli. Alright, so next we want to look at the divisions of the nervous system. So as we go through these, we'll start to break this down. We're going to give some definitions to each of these things, and then we'll make a mental map to try to remember all this organization. So for the CNS, whenever we're looking at the CNS, we're looking at the brain and the spinal cord. So this is going to receive all sensation, so receive all that information from sensory neurons. And it will initiate the action. So when we go back to the functions of the nervous system, initiate the action. This is going to receive, it's not going to detect, but it will receive these sensory stimuli, interpret what it means, and then respond to it. Our peripheral nervous system is anything that's not the brain or spinal cord. So we'll basically say everything else. And really, actually, we'll do better than this. We'll say all nerves that are either, so we can say sensory nerves, or we also have these motor nerves. And these motor nerves can then either go to muscles or glands. And actually, instead of breaking it down like that, you'll see why I don't want to do that tree diagram just yet. So let's say we have nerves, and under that, let's say that we have sensory nerves and motor nerves, or neurons, whatever you want to say. And these motor neurons can innervate muscles and glands. And I didn't want to do that tree diagram yet because we're going to put all of these different divisions of the nervous system into a tree diagram at the end. Okay, so terms that you need to be familiar with this peripheral nervous system is afferent division and the efferent division. So remember, we have sensory information and motor information in this peripheral nervous system. So now when we go to PNS, we're now breaking this PNS into the afferent division and the efferent division. So the afferent division, this is going to be all information. This is going to be your sensory and all your sensory information. This is going to be from the PNS to the CNS. So let's just say that we had our person and he gets touched here on the finger. The afferent system, we've detected this with a sensory neuron and we're sending it up here to the CNS, to the spinal cord. So maybe we respond with a reflex from the spinal cord, or maybe we send this information up to the brain so we can interpret it and then respond that way. So if you see the trail, it's from the hand towards the spinal cord. So we're going to say this information arrives at the CNS. That's how you can remember afferent for arrives. Okay, efferent division, this is going to be our motor division of the nervous system. Let me get rid of our guy here. So this is our motor division. This is going to be from the CNS to the PNS. And all that's saying, this is saying like when we're at, here's our body, here's our brain, this is the spinal cord. So the efferent division is going to be from the CNS, so from the spinal cord outwards. So that's what we mean. We don't mean that the efferent division is part of the CNS. That's not what this means. The efferent division is part of the peripheral nervous system, not the central nervous system. Central nervous system is just that brain and the spinal cord. So we'll start at that brain or spinal cord and we'll go outward towards the hand to like maybe move it away. That'd be a motor response. That's this efferent division. And then over here, whenever we talked about like maybe we felt some heat, that's the afferent division. So two examples. Afferent division, sensory information. We feel the heat and then we respond by moving the hand. Okay. Cool. So if we want to look at this, we can say that this information exits the CNS. Starts in the CNS and then exits. Starts near the CNS. Okay, so we can now break this efferent division, these motor responses, into two more divisions. So we can either have our somatic or we can have our autonomic. So now let's do our efferent division. And actually we'll go like this. We'll say the PNS, and the part of the PNS we're looking at now is the efferent division. So when we look at the two, we have somatic and we have autonomic. Not automatic, autonomic. So our somatic nervous system, these are going to be motor neurons, because remember, this efferent division is our motor division. So these are going to be motor neurons that are going to innervate skeletal muscle. So we've already talked about these somatic motor neurons at the neuromuscular junction, and now we can see what part of the nervous system they're a part of. They're part of this efferent division of the PNS. So this is going to be motor neurons going to skeletal muscle. We know that this is under conscious control. So these actions are voluntary. And then we have the autonomic nervous system. So these are going to innervate things like cardiac and smooth muscle and glands. So these are going to be motor But instead of for skeletal muscle, now we have cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. We talked about glandular secretion in Unit 2. These are not conscious control, so this is all involuntary stuff. So heartbeat, movement of smooth muscle, secretion of mucus, all this different stuff is coming from your autonomic nervous system. And then we can break this up further into our sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions. And now we're going to look at the sympathetic versus our parasympathetic. So we had PNS, and then we went to the efferent side of that. We broke up that efferent system into our somatic and autonomic nervous systems, and now we're going to take a step further looking at this autonomic nervous system. So this autonomic nervous system is made up of our sympathetic and parasympathetic. So your sympathetic is going to be your fight or flight. This is related to survival. And I'm going to go through a little schematic, and we're going to go through different organs and see what the sympathetic and parasympathetic responses are. This is rest or digest. So these are like housekeeping tasks. These divisions basically go to the same places with different effects. And let me pull up the schematic. Okay, before we do this diagram, let's really quickly do these. Let's do this tree diagram. So this is a really good mental map to have on the test. So you have the CNS and the PNS. So the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system is going to be your brain and your spinal cords. So the way I like to think about this, we know that we have our brain, we know that we have our spinal cords. We need information to get to our brain and get to our spinal cords. So that's going to be our afferent and efferent divisions of our peripheral nervous system. So we have information arriving to the CNS, and we have information exiting the CNS. That's going to be our afferent, efferent divisions of our peripheral nervous system. Then we can go to the right again and say, okay, well, we have different, because remember, this afferent information is sensory information. This efferent information is motor information. So if I'm looking at my different types of motor information, I know that I can either be going to skeletal muscle, which is voluntary, or something like cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or gland that's involuntary. So I can have my somatic and my autonomic nervous systems. So once again, this somatic was skeletal, and autonomic, that was going to be stuff like cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. We can then break that autonomic even further into our sympathetic and parasympathetic. And this has to do with fight or flight. This has to do with rest or digest and housekeeping tools. So hopefully this helps. Hopefully this little schematic helps you get everything situated. We know that our brain is going to be responding to these stimuli like fire, like pressure, like touch, all these different things, like temperature. So we have to get information to the brain and the spinal cord. So we have a division from the peripheral nervous system and information going to the spinal cord. This is sensory information that arrives to the brain and spinal cord. That's going to be our afferent peripheral nervous system. And then this efferent division, this is going to be stuff exiting the central nervous system. So this is going to be our motor responses to whatever that sensory information was. So these motor responses can either be going to something to excite this tissue that we think about, or exciting tissue that we don't think about. So we think about moving, so we walk, that's activating our skeletal muscle, that's that somatic nervous system. Our heart beats, our lungs breathe, do breathing for us. So those are autonomic, those are involuntary, we don't think about that. Food moves from your stomach to your small intestine and then through your large intestine, that smooth muscle. Those are all autonomic impulses. So we have sympathetic and parasympathetic. So what I like to do, I think the best way to do this is with this picture. Basically what you want to ask yourself whenever you're doing sympathetic and parasympathetic is just say, well, if a tiger was chasing me, what would I do? Okay? If a tiger was chasing me, what would I do? So we'll start with this sympathetic, because that's when the tiger is chasing you. So what do I need when a tiger's chasing me, because that's going to be our fight or flight. If a tiger is chasing me, what am I going to do to my eyesight? Do I need to see more or less? If I'm running through the woods away from this tiger, or running through the jungle away from this tiger, or running on the savannah away from this lion, what do I need to do with my vision? Do I need to be able to see more or less? Hopefully you pick that you need to be able to see more. So you're going to dilate those pupils. You're running, you need to be able to see stuff, so you dilate it. Let's keep running. If you've ever had fight or flight, if you've ever had that adrenaline rush before a speech, that's your sympathetic, that's your ancestral nervous system, your sympathetic nervous system preparing you for this fight or flight task, which is public speaking. Even though that's not a threat to our lives, we see it as intimidating and threatening, so our sympathetic nervous system goes off. If you think about it, you're standing there, you're trying to talk, your mouth is really dry. That's because the sympathetic is going to inhibit this flow of saliva. Let's go back to running from the tiger, or you can do the same. You can say sympathetic activation whenever you're about to give a speech. If you're about to give a speech, what happens to your heart rate? If you're running from a tiger, what happens to your heart rate? It's accelerating, and that's because we want to be able to increase blood flow to get oxygen to those muscles, because we're running from the tiger, trying to flight to keep us alive. All right, let's think about the lungs. You're running from a tiger. Do you need to be able to breathe more or less? You need to be able to breathe more. You're running more. Your oxygen consumption is more to make that ATP through those aerobic respiration mechanisms we talked about in the last few videos. So to be able to get more oxygen into our lungs, we're going to dilate those bronchi. When you're running, do you need to be digesting food? When you're sprinting from a tiger, do you need to be digesting food? No, that's a waste of energy while you're running. You need to be able to run so that you can go ahead and eat more and digest. You don't want to be digesting. You don't want to be expending energy doing something that's not going to help you survive. So this inhibiting the flow of saliva has some enzymes in it, we'll see next semester, that helps break down some food. We don't need saliva while we're running for our lives, because we don't need to be digesting food while we're running for our lives. So this digestive system gets cut off from sympathetic. And the liver, this is our liver. So what it's saying, conversion of glycogen to glucose, we're running for our lives, right? So we need this glucose molecule to turn into these two pyruvates, and these pyruvates can go into the mitochondria, and eventually we'll get ATP, right? So what this is saying is breakdown of glycogen to glucose is basically saying get more ATP. We need ATP to contract the skeletal muscles because we're running from that tiger. We'll talk about adrenaline next semester when we get to the endocrine system, but the adrenaline is going to speed up our heartbeat. It's going to get us more blood to our skeletal muscles when we're running, so we'll talk about that. But basically this fight or flight feeling comes from that adrenaline. And then when you're running for your life, do you need to pee? No. So it inhibits this bladder contraction. All right, let's do parasympathetic now. Now you've run from the tiger, maybe you set up a trap and you've killed it, and now you've brought it back to your tribe 20,000 years ago to eat. So now you're sitting by the fire. You're sitting by the fire. Are you running? No. Do you need to be able to see a lot when you're just chilling, hanging out by the fire with your friends? No. So parasympathetic will cause vasoconstriction of those pupils. You're just chilling, so you want to be able to eat food. That's going to get our saliva going. You're just hanging out, resting, digesting. You don't need your heart beating really fast. Again, you're not running, so it's going to constrict the bronchi. And remember, we said back here, same places with different effects. So as you're seeing, we're going to these same places like the eyes, like the salivary glands, like the heart, and we're just doing the opposite. So I'll let you play around with those. The easiest way to do, just put yourself running from a tiger and say, what do I need this organ to do to help me survive while I'm running from a tiger? All right, that's going to be it for this division of the nervous system video.